Wonderful. Thank you, Tadas, and thank you, Scott, also for being here, my advisor. Welcome to the Conscious Awareness of Being Alive, my progress report for the research project for the dissertation. Before we get started, as a first step in this journey, I would actually like everyone to help demonstrate what this phenomena is, to join me in allowing me to guide you in a moment of conscious awareness of your aliveness. It's very simple. It will take just a few moments. So if you'd like, you can place your hand on your heart and just become aware of perhaps the weight of your hand on your chest, the warmth of your chest on your hand, your breathing, your heartbeat, circulation, these external markers of aliveness. And then become aware of that intangible essence of aliveness that perhaps is ineffable. And then raise your face up towards the sky. Allow a smile to come to your face and either say aloud or think to yourself, hey, I am alive. Thank you for joining me in that experience. And I hope that was, as you let that kind of sink in, I hope that was indicative of the difference between the background awareness that we have all of the time. Every day we have this awareness, yes, I am alive, I exist, I'm breathing, yeah. But there is quite a difference between that background pre-reflective awareness and the conscious awareness of being alive. When we bring that awareness to the forefront of our consciousness, of our awareness. And interestingly, despite my deep research, there is not anyone else who, as far as I have been able to see, despite looking, who has studied that intentional action or that intentional awareness of bringing one's aliveness to that focal awareness. So there is a body of research on aliveness as a feeling and as a sensation, but it treats that awareness of aliveness as that background pre-reflective feeling and sensation. So Thomas Fuchs has an incredible paper called The Feelings of Being Alive. And then building on another researcher called Damasio's work, Emilia Barile has a paper called The Interoceptive Underpinnings of Feeling Alive. And she comes so close because she starts to talk about how the aliveness is this very deep, rich experience, but she doesn't quite come to say that there's a difference between the background awareness and the foreground awareness. And similarly with Matthew Ratcliffe, who talks about something called existential feelings, it comes very close, but it's not quite there. So this is a very exciting new frontier area of research. And there are some really exciting fields that offer precedent for my study, which is, again, exploring that conscious awareness of being alive. And interestingly, one of them, and perhaps the one that offers the best scaffolding, is the field called mortality salience. Some of you may have heard of something called terror management theory, or the work of Ernest Becker, for example. The overarching field is called mortality salience. And the reason that offers such great scaffolding for aliveness awareness is because it does actually very distinctly differentiate between what they call proximal and distal awareness of mortality. So proximal awareness of mortality, or rather we'll start with distal. Distal awareness of mortality is that sort of background awareness that we all have, that one day we are going to die. Proximal awareness of mortality is when we bring that awareness of mortality to the forefront. And there's a huge body of research, like I said, exploring what happens when we have a proximal awareness of our mortality. So that is mortality salience, and that whole field. And a lot of that research is really why I structured my study the way I structured it, which I'll share with you later in this presentation. There's also a good body of research on foreground and background feelings in general. They just don't specifically talk about aliveness. And then finally, turning a page a little bit on the foreground and background element of aliveness, we can look at, well, who else is talking about aliveness as a psychological, a measurable psychological variable. And Ryan and Frederick here, they actually they have a measure of subjective vitality. And they define subjective vitality as a measure of two things: aliveness and energy. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the research and the field any further, because I could speak for hours on it. If you want to talk about it, call me. We can have a long conversation. But we'll get into my study in the interest of time. These are my research questions. The one in blue at the top is my primary research question. And because this is such a new frontier with so little research about it, my primary research question is obviously very, very broad. How do people experience this phenomenon, right? Like, let's start with understanding, how do people experience exposure to a reminder of their aliveness? And this is very similar, again, to hark back to the mortality salience. A lot of the mortality salience studies begin with a research question akin to that, which is, how do people experience exposure to a reminder of their death? So again, I'm using that as scaffolding and inspiration throughout much of the methodology of my study. Now, my two research sub-questions in green and pink down there, or shall we call it mauve, the second 2A is, can well-being and anxiety be impacted by a focal conscious awareness of one's aliveness? Okay, so now let's understand what, again, the question in blue, how do people experience it? And dialing down a little bit, okay, well, could well-being and anxiety potentially be impacted? And then moving down into research question 2B, can a practice, again, that word practice is new here, can a practice of focal conscious awareness of one's aliveness function as a psychospiritual research? So the two keywords there, again, being practice and psychospiritual resource. And these are exploratory questions, and I'll get into how my study is geared to answer each one of these different levels of questions. So I elected to go with a convergent mixed methods design. And the reason that I chose that was partly because it is such a novel exploratory field, and there's just a lot of information to gather because there's not a lot out there. So the idea of having a qualitative element, quantitative element, and then this really cool aspect of Creswell and Plano Clark's convergent mixed methods design is this ability to kind of let those streams of data speak to one another to begin to answer some of those research questions that I just went over. So the qualitative study, in my mind, really is geared mostly to answer that large overarching top question, the how do people experience this phenomena question. The quantitative study is really, in my mind, to answer, can well-being and anxiety be impacted by this phenomenon? And then the third question, can this as a practice function as a psychospiritual research, is kind of what I'll discover in the convergent aspect of this research. Now, again, I'm trying to, with bracketing, which I'll talk more about, I'm really trying to stay open. Any one of qualitative, quantitative, or convergent could answer any of these, but I did sort of structure the study so that each one of these questions has a stream of data that my goal is to have to gather information and data on it. So how did I measure this? So for the quantitative aspect on this top line here, these top two graphics, I used two established measures. The WHO-5 Wellbeing Index is a peer-reviewed benchmark to understand an individual's well-being. The second measure that I used is called the PSS-10. That's the Perceived Stress Scale. It's a 10-question measure, again, very well established in the field to measure perceived stress, also could be called anxiety. And the way that was studied through the quantitative element is through paired t-tests. The qualitative element, as you can see on the bottom right, I'm using kind of within the phenomenological qualitative aspect, I'm using Mustaka's phenomenological framework as an inspiration, while also sort of layering the the convergent mixed methods as well. My sample, I'll get a little bit more into this later on in the study, but I ended up with 42 on the quantitative side and 13 on the qualitative side. So what did the study look like? Here's a little roadmap to help understand. As someone opted into this study, the first step that they had was to complete the intake paperwork, which included, the participant information sheet, of course, written consent, as well as everyone completed the WHO-5 and the PSS-10. Then the actual intervention consisted of a 10-day intervention where I exposed every participant to one message a day of an aliveness reminder, or, an exposure of a conscious moment of aliveness. Then at the end of those 10 days, they again completed the WHO-5, the PSS-10. I added in 4 open-ended questions because I am so passionate about this area of study, and because I didn't want to lose the opportunity if someone didn't want to participate in one of the phenomenological interviews. I just wanted that opportunity to capture some written data. And surprisingly, so numbers wise, I had 62 people participate in the intervention, 48 people, or rather 42 people completed both the pre and post surveys. And then 38 out of 42 actually did complete the written assessment, which was optional. So I was quite surprised that despite it being an optional, and it very clearly marked as optional, people were excited to share, or there was a high completion rate rather of completing these open-ended questions. And then from there, they also had the option to opt into a phenomenological interview. I had 13 of those phenomenological interviews. So that's what the participant experience looks like. And at the end, I will be sharing the results with the participants because everybody was asking about it. And once all is said and done, I'm excited to get back in touch and share that information. So to dive a little bit further into what that intervention looked like, you're like, okay, how did you text 62 people, Kate? Were you just sitting every day sending 62 individual text messages? I actually have a tool. It's called Community that I pay for, and it allows me to send a message to a large body of people, and then all at once, and then they can actually text me back personally, but it doesn't go to the whole group. And then in this case, in this tool, you're also able to pre-schedule the messages. So I came up with this intervention. I spent many hours perfecting all of these 10 messages for one message per day for the 10 days, using my understanding of the aliveness awareness phenomenon, again, using the scaffolding of research in adjacent areas. As you can see, this message here, February 15th, that was the message that was the day before the study. And all I asked them to do was I said, hey, when you receive these messages, gently pause for one dedicated minute to take it in. So I wasn't asking them to sit down and go into a deep meditation. It was just, hey, be exposed to this aliveness reminder, sit with it for about a minute and go on with your day. And I really wanted to be sort of conservative with this particular study and just understand with a very kind of, I don't want to say superficial, that's not the right word, but a light touch, shall we say, of this aliveness reminder to understand what can that do on a very basic level. And then here's a couple of sample messages. This February 16th is the first day of message. And then February 23rd was partway through the intervention. And I'll read it aloud. It said, pause and register. There is a you here, aware, present, experiencing, alive. Diving into my implementation of all of this and the data collection. And what you're seeing here with the aliveness experiment and this heart graphic and the bright yellow color, that's a sample of some of the marketing materials that I had put together for recruitment for this study, which I had a website, I made a YouTube video, I recruited via Facebook and Instagram, some email outreach, LinkedIn, and the participant criteria was 18 to, I think, 80 years of age. It was particularly English-speaking individuals, all genders, and there wasn't a ton, and then other than, not having any, sort of psychospiritual crises happening, there wasn't a lot of specifications as far as who I was looking for. I was really kind of looking for general population to understand how this phenomena might impact them. And like I said, this two-way texting offered unexpected mid-intervention feedback. When I scheduled all these messages out, I kind of forgot, like, oh, people might respond. But this is one of the messages that I received. Someone had messaged and said, hey, I have had this Thich Nhat Hanh quote on my fridge forever, and I never really fully understood what it meant. And the quote from Thich Nhat Hanh is, because you are alive, everything is possible, which is also one of my favorite quotes for obvious reasons. And this individual said, hey, I never understood what it meant until I got this message today. I'm feeling the aliveness. So that was a cool thing. And a lot of people were hearting the messages, and I got a few responses. So I didn't reply to anyone because I didn't want to intervene with the experience, but it was a cool thing for me to receive some of that feedback, just to understand how it was landing for some people. Now, there's a lot of data in this study, and I'm still working my way through it. So I've got 3 primary data streams. The first one is obviously these 42 survey responses. Of the 62 that participated in the study, 42 completed both the beginning and ending surveys. So I've got that quantitative data. I've got the participant interview data, which is 13 video interviews of about 30 minutes each. And then I've got these written responses again, which I didn't expect to get such a great response to, but we've got a lot of data to comb through. And just to kind of pause here, I wanted to share 2 comments that came out of the qualitative interviews. The first one is from subject BRBE, who is a female, and she said, one of the days I was taking a walk during the workday, and she was referring to one of the days of the study. She said, the whole walk, I am stressed. I'm like, I have this to do and this to do and this to do. I shouldn't be walking. And then your text message popped up, and it brought me to the present moment. And I was like, oh my God, like I'm outside on this beautiful day and I am enjoying the walk. Like, I'm fortunate that 1, I can walk, and 2, I'm alive to be able to walk. And that's a gift. An interesting anecdote on this particular participant is that I learned about her is that she actually, a couple years prior, had gotten hit by a car like a week before her wedding and broken both of her legs and a hip, and actually had to attend her own wedding in a wheelchair. And I just thought that was a really interesting anecdote to this particular subsection from her interview, because this is a person that got hit by a car a couple years ago and couldn't walk to her own wedding and had forgotten about the gift of walking, and the message helped her to kind of regain that for at least for a moment. The second quote comes from an 80-year-old male who participated in the study, and he's a career lawyer. And he said, I asked him, to talk about what it's like for him when he received the messages. And he said, the difference is I'm not thinking about a case or a file or some other person or something that I have to do next week. Walking past the ginkgo tree and the flowers that are out there, and there's some roses. And, I'm much more aware of my surroundings if I think about being alive. The present moment is there. I'm not worried about the fact that I didn't do something yesterday, And so it makes for a more pleasant existence. I thought it was cool that both of these quotes took place, and this was not the only ones. There were other people who had this, really awakening where they really became aware of their external surroundings. They became very aware of the present moment, and both of these happened when these individuals were out taking a walk. Now let's talk about something dicey here, guys. Let's talk about bracketing, and then we'll move on to analysis. So as you can tell, I'm very passionate about this topic. And so bracketing is very, very important for me. And what I have found is that bracketing in my case is not something that I just did at the beginning of the study. It's something that I have needed to do every single time I engage with the study, every time I engage with the data, because I literally have a podcast about being alive. I have my social media and in writing that I do, I write extensively about aliveness and mortality and the beauty of being alive. So this is something where I've had to really do a lot of transpersonal cleansing every time I engage with the data, to just understand that not every not every intervention hits for every person, right? Like breath work isn't for everybody, meditation isn't for everybody, and neither is the conscious awareness of one's aliveness. It's not going to hit for everybody on every day. And I always just remind myself to clear, so I can clear my expectations of what might come from this phenomena and this practice. And so it's been a really beautiful practice, actually, after all these years that I've engaged with the ideas of aliveness and mortality, to really sort of cleanse myself and come at it with new eyes has been really beautiful, and of course a challenge as well. Okay, y'all, let's move on to results. So in my quantitative analysis, like I said, I used the WHO-5 and the PSS-10 well-established measures, paired t-tests and Wilcoxon methodologies, and I have those results in hand, which I'll be sharing with you momentarily. On the qualitative side, I've got a lot of work to do. I'm not going to lie. I've got all the transcripts written. And then I watched all of the videos again and cleaned all of them by hand, which was, I found it to be a very rich process. I've noted high-level themes, which I'll share with you on the next couple of slides. Then, of course, I've got all of the standard phenomenological work to do on the qualitative side, open-ended responses, those written responses I'll be coding, as well as the transcripts coding, codebook and theme generation, textual and structural descriptions. And then, I started this with the intention of blending, and this is a limitation that I want to be really clear about. I started this whole project with wanting to use Mustakas, and then I kind of added in the convergent mixed methods, and I had the intention to also do intuitive inquiry, and this is definitely a case of like eyes too big for the belly. So the intuitive inquiry layer is really more of an inspiration at this point rather than like a formal application of the methodology. So I just want to be really clear how that's changed from my proposal to now. And then finally, of course, since this is convergent mixed methods, I get to integrate all of that data and answer my own research questions, as well as any other questions that might present themselves during the convergence of all of these streams of data. Like, where do the quantitative results support the qualitative results? Where do they diverge? And of course, what questions might be left unanswered that can offer opportunities for future research? Okay, drum roll. So far, we have some results. So on the WHO-5, the well-being measure, which again measures well-being at the beginning of the study and then at the end of the 10-day intervention, we saw a significant increase, a large effect. The Cohen's d was 0.83. We actually saw that go from a mean of 18.6 to 21.8 at the end of study. 18.6 at the beginning of the study was how people came in, and then their well-being, the mean was measured at 21.8 at the end of the study, and a p-value well below 0.001. Now, on the stress measure, we saw that decrease, which again supports my hypothesis, which is great. But the perceived stress measure, which also is sort of a measure of anxiety, I saw a significant decrease, large effect. The Cohen's d is 0.74, again, a p-value well below 0.001. The means on that one was the anxiety, or the perceived stress started at 25.4 at the beginning of the study, and at the end the mean was 21.8. And both parametric and non-parametric tests were consistent on both the WHO-5 and the PSS-10. As far as the qualitative side, as you know, as I illustrated on my other slide, I've got a ways to go in synthesizing that data, but some of the early emergent themes are this micro to macro perspective shift, a pop into or a drop into or a new keen awareness of the present moment. And then many people use the word reset. A lot of people use the word flip. They use the word rumination came up a lot, that they had been ruminating, and then when they received the message, it popped them out of rumination, and a reset with clarity on what's important. And I'll illustrate this last one, or kind of all of them, with two more participant quotes. So subject BOKN said that being alive, or being aware of your aliveness, it shifted my perspective about what is and is not truly important. And then subject NICO said, after I did the message exercise, whatever followed next I felt very present in whatever I was doing, whatever's happening in my life, and in whatever's most important. So that element of sort of that shift from that micro to macro perspective, and sort of a re-engineering of priorities on what's important, or not even a re-engineering, but sort of a renewed view on what's important, was a very common theme that came up. Limitations and future discussion, tons of limitations. Of course, there was no control group in this study. I thought about that partway through, and at that point the ship had sort of sailed, but I would have loved to do a control group to understand what was just sort of like a baseline, right, or a benchmark rather, of what someone's well-being and anxiety was over the course of that 10 days. And that actually communicates to the final bullet here on the far right, the global conflict outbreak. So the intervention had completed, but a couple of days after I sent out the follow-up studies, the WHO-5, the PSS-10, the open-ended questions, and the invitation for the phenomenological interviews, that was really when the global conflict was, the heat was very high, shall we say. And I can say from personal experience that my anxiety was certainly higher than normal at that time. So that may have affected the data in some way. And again, because there wasn't a control group, I wasn't able to compare that. Given the fact that anxiety did decrease and well-being increased, I don't think it tarnished the data to the point where, I'm concerned, but it is certainly a limitation to consider. Another limitation that I didn't mention when we talked earlier about the PSS-10 is that the PSS-10, again, a well-known measure, the text in that, it actually says, over the past month, I have felt, and then there's 10 questions that the subject answers. But that wasn't going to work for my study. I elected a 10-day intervention because I felt that 7 days was too short. I was a little leery that 14 days, I was going to have too great of a drop-off of completion rate. And so 10 felt really good in some of the literature that I had looked at. But that meant that I had to change this intervention of the PSS-10, because at the end of the study, if I said, how have you been feeling over the past month, that doesn't really make sense. So I had to amend, and I'll talk about this in my dissertation, but I had to amend it to say, in the past 10 days, I have felt, and then that was amended for every question. And then finally, like I said, with bracketing, the researcher proximity, my proximity to the phenomenon, is certainly something that it has been very top of mind for me throughout this whole thing, and I've been really actively working with it. But then there's also the subject proximity to phenomenon, because I was gathering subjects from largely my personal networks, and some of these people I don't know, but they may have been exposed to my work in the past. And so some of the people who did come into the study are aware of the phenomena of conscious awareness of aliveness prior to the 10-day intervention. None of them have ever experienced a 10-day intervention like the one that I applied here. However, there were some subjects who had never thought about conscious aliveness, and then there was a subset of subjects who are aware of the phenomena of conscious awareness of aliveness. So there was a mix there, but that's a limitation, because it means that not everyone coming in was completely fresh to the phenomena. And then finally, to close us out, opportunities for future research. And we'll start here at the top left in yellow. I would love to have a larger sample size, and I would love to have a control group, like I said, 62, and then ultimately a 42 subject sample size was fine for a master's, but I would love to see a much larger one. And then moving over to the right, this blue box here, a facilitated aliveness awareness intervention study, where just like we did at the beginning of this presentation today, I bring people either on Zoom or in person, and I guide them into conscious awareness of aliveness and measure pre, post, as well as phenomenological data. That would be amazing. And it would be interesting to compare the results of these two studies. And then the pink box here, longitudinal study to explore long-term effects. I would actually love to follow up with people 6 months down the line, a year down the line, to find out if they're using the conscious awareness of being alive as a practice in their life or not. And other understandings about how that affected them. And then this green box here, it would be great to have a validated measure of the conscious awareness, the conscious aliveness experience, so that it can be leveraged in other areas of research. And then finally, because I am a total neuroscience nerd, and I love the way that transpersonal psychology blends with neuroscience, I would love to explore the neuropsychological correlates, especially because, as you saw in my early qualitative themes, we saw this element of rumination being disrupted, this element of a theme of a reset coming up, being popped into the present moment. So I'm forming this side hypothesis about the conscious awareness of aliveness potentially having an impact possibly on the DMN, the default mode network, possibly. And then you might be wondering, who is this young child and why is she on this slide? And just in closing, that is I, 40 years ago, who had no idea that all these decades later I would find something that I'm so passionate about and I really enjoy studying. This research project has been such a highlight of the master's program for me, and I feel so prepared to run it because of all the work that we've done thus far in our 2.5 years. So I just look back at this little girl and I just feel very grateful that, all these years later I get the opportunity to do this master's, to do this research project, and to share it all with you today. And I put it on the slide for future research because I would love to continue pushing this field forward and expand it so that there are lots of people studying it. So again, thank you for listening today. Thank you to my incredible advisor, Scott Buckler. And I'd love to take some questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Kate. Really exciting presentation. Well, what's a precious gift to be alive?